action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, business and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards. Today I've caught something contagious. Luckily, that something is their co-founder, Paul Kemp-Robertson. A chap with serious smarts for global marketing comms, Paul is the brain behind Contagious, part editorial, part consultancy, part research. They get their kicks helping brands and agencies be more creative, get smarter, and deliver better work. Previously, he was part of the launch team behind Shots magazine before going on to become editor, and more recently, Leo Burnett's worldwide director of creative resources. Paul says marketers should not be afraid to ask heretical questions. By this, I mean the kind that suck the air out of the room or make you feel you risk losing your job just by asking them. But they're exactly the interrogations that could protect your brand by sparking ideas your rivals don't have the guts to even think about. Welcome to the show, Paul.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Right. 7 quickfire questions, Paul. London or Chicago?
London. I love Chicago, but London all the way.
Borough or Borough Market?
Again, Middlesbrough all the way. I love Borough Market. It's where our office is based, and it's a fantastically buzzy place to be, but my heart is always a Teessider.
Nice. Well, sticking with that theme then, Juninho or Ravanelli?
Juninho. He wears a magic hat. Absolute legend. Well, the little fella, as he's known in Middlesbrough.
Right, the original Contagious commandment. This one's a bit unfair. So be useful, be relevant, or be entertaining.
Home, useful, work, entertaining.
Okay. Right, ridiculously, we've got famous Pauls. Scholes or Gaza?
I have to say Gaza because he played for Middlesbrough at one point, although I think Paul is probably the more reliable character, isn't he?
Yeah, I forgot he played for Borough. Of course he did. He
had a sort of a spree towards the end. You know, he's actually famous for crashing the team coach into the walled entrance of the training ground because for a lunchtime jape.
Wow, the stuff he got away with. 2 more: metaverse or metaverse, as in MEH.
Yeah, definitely. At the moment, definitely the MEH. I think it's got the potential to grow, but at the moment, don't believe the hype.
Finally, this is with the help of my brother Andrew. Raise the creative bar or a drunken night out at the gutter bar?
A drunken night out in the gutter bar. It's only once a year, so you can get away with it, can't you?
Nice. So listen, thank you so much for joining us. We always make a point on this show of asking every guest about their path to where they are now. And we find that more often than not, it's rarely linear, which I think warrants celebration. Could you start by telling the audience what was your first ever job? And then what was your first proper job?
Well, my first job was I worked in a sports shop in Middlesbrough for about £10 a day, and I was a sales assistant. And then I did loads of jobs when I was at university, things like kitchen porter. I worked as a technician on a industrial conveyor belt repair line, which was quite interesting in a heat wave, patching industrial conveyor belts with glue, and I got made redundant after 3 weeks because I was so terrible at it. And then I was a runner on commercial shoots and music videos and so on. So I guess my very first proper job was at Shots. I was the intern who became editor, basically. So I was involved in the launch issue. I knew nothing about advertising. In my interview, I said that Saatchi & Saatchi was an investment bank. So they didn't give me the job as a researcher. They said, if you want to come and help on the first issue, we'll pay you £50 a week in cash. And that's how it started. So that was my first proper job.
At that stage then of your life, did you have any intention to go into the marketing and advertising world?
Not necessarily, no. I think my background, my dad's a sports journalist. His job was to cover Middlesbrough Football Club for his sins, hence my sort of passion for that team, having travelled all the length and breadth of the country. So for me, I was always good at English and writing. I did a drama and English degree at Goldsmiths, one of those courses that Rishi Sunak's probably trying to demolish right now. So my intention was to try and get into TV or journalism. I was on the brink of doing a sort of journalist course, and then decided to do a master's actually at Goldsmiths in drama, sort of television drama. And then during the process of that, I had sort of various part-time jobs. So I was working in market research. I was doing things like mystery shopping for a market research agency, phoning up most Royal Mail offices around the country, pretending to be a mystery shopper, which was excruciatingly embarrassing. But then I worked on this sort of freelance contract for a corporate video company who made, sort of corporate videos for the likes. This is again before the internet and so on. This was training videos for Barclays and Esso and so on. And on the last shoot I was doing, the production manager that was giving me a lift to this farm somewhere in Buckinghamshire was moaning that she had 3 jobs on her answer machine. And I was literally going to be unemployed or back at the market research agency the next week. And I sort of mentioned my plight and sort of gave her my little sort of business card that I printed at WH Smith's. She just, I think, took pity on me. She was much older than me and just sort of felt sorry because I was literally trying to get into the industry type thing. And just by sheer coincidence, she met Guy, who's now my partner on Contagious, who was creating this funny little company called Shots. And she'd worked with him 7 years previously at Thames Television, had never met him in the interview period, bumped into him in a restaurant. And long story short, she said, "Oh, can I give you the name of this little lad to come and meet you?" Yeah, as I say, I met him and spent the first half an hour of the interview talking about Thailand because he asked me what my experience in the industry was. And I said, well, not very much because I've been in Thailand for 2 months on holiday with my girlfriend. And he goes, "Oh, I'm half Thai." So 40 minutes of Thailand and then 5 minutes at the end, what do you know about advertising, which is when I admitted that I thought Saatchi's was a bank. So I didn't get the job, but I got the sort of internship type, 50 quid a week thing. And that took me into an industry that I had no idea about, growing up in Middlesbrough and expecting to go off on this completely different route and journalism. I thought advertising was a department like, say, Ford cars, their advertising would sit next to their sprockets department. It would just be something like, churned out by a company sort of thing. So the whole idea of an advertising agency and whatever. So it was a really sort of seductive industry because this was sort of back in the 90s, where advertising was probably a little bit more simple because it was all around sort of film and print and so on. Yeah, so I literally stumbled into it accidentally and just took a shine.
That's really interesting. And yeah, you're right, that 90s period, I've talked about that period a few times with the likes of Paul Feldwick comes to mind. And I'm sure with Tom Roach, we spoke about those wonderful Barclaycard adverts with Rowan Atkinson and just the time where entertainment and fun just used to be a real kind of common thread with advertising. Yeah.
There's only like 4 channels on TV.
Right. Yeah, exactly that. And it's really encouraging, I find, to talk to people like yourself who perhaps pursued paths which weren't necessarily a million miles away, but paths that nonetheless were, until you discovered it via Shots and Guy, were mostly hidden from you. To me, it seems like advertising tends to be an industry that whilst you are aware of and exposed to ads, most people don't really get the fact that it is an industry in its own right until they're much older and progress, and then they might sidestep in or they might come in. But either way, there's kind of serendipity and luck at play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, because once I got into it, suddenly, you realize how interesting, exciting it is because it involves strategy as well as creativity, like solving problems. I think that's what I loved the most was, you sort of how you could distill complexity. Agencies are fantastic at really getting to the heart of a brand, what it stands for, solving friction and so on. So I just love the idea of making sort of simplicity out of complexity. And at Shots, we looked outside of the advertising industry as well. We were looking at like best in craft of film and post-production and so on, just to try and think of, what would influence the advertising industry.
And do you feel like during that time, and I suppose even now, to be honest, Paul, that you've fully let go of journalism? Because of course you can't have, because it's still a core part of what you do. but also it's almost like you've had to release it a bit to grab onto creativity and strategy and everything else that you are involved in these days.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting about, because by sort of keeping the journalistic roots, because Contagious, half the business is the Contagious IQ membership platform, which is like an editorial resource where we sort of look at the very, very best, most effective work globally that's going to influence and sort of motivate the advertising industry. But what I find interesting is that there are moments where people from sort of outside the advertising industry want to sort of lean in for a perspective. This sounds very like braggy, and I don't mean it to be braggy but I did a TED talk. And again, it was relatively by accident because we used to sort of go to a lot of the sort of TED business events. They had a subscription to Contagious for their marketing team because obviously TED is funded heavily by brand, funding, sponsorship and so on. So they needed to keep abreast of the industry. And they'd seen an article that we'd written in our magazine. This was when sort of Bitcoin was just bubbling into the consciousness. And we wrote an article about the potential of sort of branded currencies ultimately. It was like the whole thing about, currency being in flux and the idea of the value. And could brands like Patagonia, for instance, have their own currency one day where, they would assign currency to brands that they believed in that tick their sort of sustainable boxes. As a consumer, you can kind of make ethical choices very easily by, investing in the Patagonia shilling, which is pegged to the dollar or whatever, So, and that ended up, long story short, being a TED talk. It was being viewed 1.4 million times, and I did preface it when I did it because it was one of those sort of pre-TED conference events where they sort of get people to do test talks and, some of the participants get to sort of experiment with their subject matter. So it was sort of off-piste kind of thing. But I did have to preface it when I started talking. So I made a joke like saying, "Trust me, I work in advertising," and then the audience scoffs instantly.
Yeah.
But I think partly that sort of helps. That sort of sense of slight. What's sort of I don't know. A lot of people work in the advertising industry. There's a slight insecurity that you're almost like embarrassed. It's not the film industry. It's not, the tech industry. Is it proper business? And, it's all, and that potentially explains why there's so many awards, because there's a constant affirmation that what you're doing is worth a shiny gong. But as I say, I'm sort of like a massive advocate that the advertising industry, fuels growth and innovation and behavior change, and at its very, very best, can sort of change the world as well as product categories and people and so on. So,
yeah, well, I mean, if you hadn't brought up the TED Talk, I was going to, so I'm pleased you have done, and I think that start's absolutely perfect. And there's so much, there's a worrying amount of Ipsos data that kind of reinforces what you've just said about the public's perception of those in ad land. I like that kind of affirmation theory you have, and explaining why there are so many shiny gongs, because it is borderline ridiculous these days, but you can understand. But that commercial creativity, I think, is what those of us, and I include myself in this statement, those of us who have this weird love for the industry, that's probably the root of it. It's that idea that with creativity you can not only solve problems, but you can drive commercial value and real life value.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Contagious, I think one of our first little mantras, we had sort of stuck up in the kitchen of our first little office in Soho was creativity kicks the living crap out of non-creative work. We should have t-shirts made with that sort of thing. But, I've just always sort of believed we sort of try and focus on the top 5%, say, of advertising. That's part of the, the sort of the proposition behind Contagious is that we will be that editorial filter for you. So we'll look at 1,000 things and talk about the best 50 to 100, so that by seeing the best, you kind of, you become the best by learning from the best type thing. But I like the scientific definition of creativity, which is an idea that's novel, good and useful, I think. But for me, it's that sort of finding new ways to make connections between familiar things. I remember I through an old sort of Contagious deck, I found there was a quote from this motivation expert called Daniel Pink, and he described creativity as giving the world something it didn't know it was missing, which I thought was a really nice way of looking at it. And I think, advertising is, did the world need a gorilla playing drums? No. Was the world a better place for having a gorilla playing drums for 90 seconds to a Philip Collins track? Absolutely. Did the business grow as a result? Absolutely. Did, Cadbury's get a huge amount more mental availability going? Yes, they did. So, I don't know. There's an emotional connection to creativity, and I think that despite all of the changes and the new channels, the new technologies, the sort of changing consumer behaviors, all that sort of things, that I still feel, and I'm sort of, sound like Dave Trott here, who's a fantastic legend and all the rest of it, but I still feel as though that 30-second spot film has got the power in the way that nothing else does to really kind of move you, inspire you, sort of make an association or an impression in like nothing else. And I think that's, again, one of the sort of superpowers that advertising has, is to have that emotional kicker at their disposal, partly because of understanding people. I think that's one of advertising's great strengths is, the sort of the planners, the strategists and creators and so on is just really understanding what motivates people.
Yes, I often find in the industry people will ask if you're interested in behavioural science, because there's been a kind of trend over the last few years, and obviously Richard Chosson and Rory's books have also, added fuel to that kind of wave of people being more actively involved in it. But to me, and I've made this point before, so apologies, listeners, but if you work in this industry and you're not interested in human behaviour, then you're on the wrong industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that point on creativity is true. Funny enough, Daniel Pink is probably one of the first TED Talks I ever saw, actually. I think he gave a talk, 10 plus years ago now. Really, really smart guy. Do you think then, in terms of, I was going to ask, why should people take creativity as seriously as anything else in the business? And I accept you've already kind of submitted an answer to that. But I wonder, since the 90s, and I mentioned the Barclaycard ad, since the 90s, is it simply a case that there's been other distractions, or maybe there's other business forces within companies working against creativity? What do you put it down to?
Partly that a lot of businesses, not marketers, but businesses, lost some faith in advertising. Often the world works in pendulums, and the sort of pendulum swung towards programmatic, rationalization, optimization, ROI, instant results, and like really a sort of like a heavy sales focus, thinking that made marketing, sort of a more valuable asset within the boardroom. There's always this put down of the marketers is that it's the colouring in department, or that they're not quite the grown-ups in the boardroom type thing. And there was a way of sort of trying to suddenly make marketing feel more valid, and because it could be personalised and whatever. And I think that it was almost like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That yes, a lot of those arguments were valid, and a lot of performance marketing is incredibly efficient and can make a difference. God knows I've bought socks off Instagram. Have you bought your Nordic socks off Instagram, Giles? But anyway, people forget that sort of creativity is a muscle. It really needs to sort of to be worked on, and it should form part of a business culture. And I think, I'm sure people have often in your podcast referred to Les Binet and Peter Field and all the work they've done looking at the value of creative effectiveness. You've got authors like Paul Feldwick, famous former planner, saying the same thing, where it's that, advertising, and this is why when we go back to the 90s, that what advertising was fantastic at was driving fame. And that's why we call Contagious to a large extent, is that ideas that people want to share and talk about and react to and pass on and watch again. And again, you sort of come back to video. It doesn't have to be a 30-second commercial, but video, the propensity of like being prepared to watch something endlessly because it entertains you and you see a different layer to it every time, or it's your favorite song in the background, or as a funny little insight or whatever. And I think that's what sometimes businesses sort of lose sight of, the fact that having an emotional impact on people can actually drive sort of outsized gains when it comes to sales, loyalty, penetration, market share, all those sciencey things. Don't ever forget that it's the art of advertising that packs the power. I think John Haggerty, he was always saying, their sort of one of their underlying principles at BBH was our objective is effectiveness, which is what every marketer wants, what every CFO wants and chief exec wants. But he was saying as an agency, and obviously at the time, like the most creative agency on the planet, arguably, our strategy is creativity. So objective is effectiveness, strategy is creativity, which I think is a fantastic way of sort of encapsulating the value of powerful commercial creativity.
Yeah, I mean, to quote another great, sadly a late great, Jeremy Bullmore, you can't move from me quoting Jeremy Bullmore, to be honest, Paul. So there's a lovely line of his that we've had on our website for years now, which is: brands are fiendishly complicated, elusive, slippery, half real, half virtual things. And when CEOs try to think about brands, their brains hurt.
That's a good quote.
One of the issues is just being able to define and truly measure effectiveness. And it's not so much that it can't be measured, it's more that it's relatively very difficult versus measuring stuff that might happen further down the funnel.
Yes, exactly. It's more intangible.
Yeah, exactly that.
But I do think maybe sort of, after the pandemic, that it was one of those things where people suddenly wanted more human connection. They wanted to be entertained and consoled or whatever. So whether the sort of that pendulum I talked about started swinging back towards less, rational, targeted type advertising and more communal stories and human stories. So maybe, that sort of explains the shift I think that we're seeing. But I don't know, there's something that the Contagious Advisory Department talks about a lot, is that people often say, creativity is a superpower, it's a fuel, it's an elixir, all this sort of stuff. But what we would say is that creativity is like such an essential part of your business. A lot of CEOs, CFOs feel very comfortable talking about zero-based budgeting. where you start with a zero budget and then justify every single cost. And we sort of say, well, start with zero-based creativity. Is that you cannot afford not to be creative. There are so many studies that will show you that, cliched, standard, formulaic, very sort of KPI heavy, generic advertising just gets ignored. And you're actually wasting money by doing inefficient advertising that people don't care about, don't want to watch, don't even register. I think people have developed a sort of cognitive dissonance to most advertising. So you've got, which is why, I keep going back, like, he's like the gorilla playing drums cuts through, because it's surprising, it jolts you, it's unexpected, really charming, related back to the brand, So that's what, to me, it boils down to, that you can actually, through creativity, get those outsized gains in, as I say, sales and loyalty and all the things that, the left brain side of a business wants. The right brain side can actually deliver if you trust it and invest in it and try and bake it into your culture so that, creativity is rewarded and celebrated and it's part of your mission as opposed to being denigrated as the colouring in department.
Yeah, to be honest, I've never heard anyone use the term zero-based creativity, but I really like it. It's really good. It's really good. I might have to steal that, Paul.
I can't take credit for that. It has to come from our Contagious advisory unit, who are made up of some much more clever people than I am. That's part of my trick at Contagious, is that you hire people who are much more intelligent and switched on than I am.
Company of giants and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking about pendulum swinging then, you were at Cannes Lions recently, and you've very recently penned a very smart and succinct Cannes condensed article. So one of the things which we're talking about, because it's topical, but also it does represent a threat of sorts, or certainly something that is easily, I suppose, misunderstood and people are wrestling with, is AI. What were your observation at Cannes, and what's your take on what our past guest Dave Harlan calls the diligent robot overlords?
That's a good way of describing them. Obviously, at Cannes, AI dominated a lot of conversations. Cannes has become increasingly more like South by Southwest. There are so many activities going on at any one time. So not just in the Palais, but in a range of boats and beaches and whatever. And I think AI, if you looked across the week, was probably the number one topic after diversity, inclusion, and sustainability as well. But I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. We ran an article on the Contagious blog with an interview with Michael Farmer, who's a guy that wrote that very kind of vicious attack on the advertising industry a few years ago called Madison Avenue Manslaughter. Because everything he used to be in advertising, and then he crossed over to consultancy and just saw what he regarded as a massive fundamental weakness in the advertising agency model. So just went for it in the form of a book. And then his new book, which is Madison Avenue Makeover, is charting the progress of an agency called Huge, whose sort of chief exec basically decided that the agency model was flawed and he was going to move away from sort of like a serviced, fee-based, people-based model into the one that was more product-based. So I think Michael Farmer's book is about that sort of journey, coming in as a skeptic, a healthy skeptic. But in the interview, getting back to AI, obviously it was a question that we asked him. He basically said that AI is like pouring gasoline on the trends that we discussed in Madison Avenue Manslaughter. He said that the business model of the holding companies to a very considerable extent is to get paid for bodies. And I've seen enough of AI to know that a lot of those bodies are going to be replaced by AI, like particularly in media planning and also around digital and social creativity. And he's saying if that, digital and social content represents 40% of the total workload of your agency, then he reckons 20% of an agency headcount could be displaced by AI very easily. And he said if your overhead is counting people and charging for those people, you're kind of in trouble. I think he pointed out that agencies, they basically, the fees are based on 2 times the cost of their cheapest person, and a consultancy is more like 5 times an average or well-paid person. So he was sort of saying that you get these doom mongers saying that AI is going to rip the industry to shreds, we're in the loser's game and all this sort of stuff. But I don't know, I found that from our point of view that we're definitely in a novelty phase with AI, and it is going to have ramifications on advertising from things like casting and content and so on. But there are lots of opportunities to harness it for good. So I know that you've got a lot of planners who are using like chat GPT and so on to like pass very complex briefs or complex academic papers and getting to the absolute nuggets of what's important. You can use it in pitches or to visualize stuff to help clients come with you, because sometimes that's part of that, the lack of faith, or that sometimes clients need a creative leap to understand the points you're trying to land. So, yes, AI is going to be very much part of the industry, but you hear these sort of interesting stories like a lot of creative directors are saying, we have a brief or an idea or, some sort of concept, stick it into chat GPT or some sort of generative AI machine. And, whatever solutions come out or ideas come out, we know that we need to ignore them. Because it's based on a massive data set of things that have gone before. So it's like the way to be original and creative and so on is to be human, because humans can be deviant in a way that machines can't. One of the talks that I did see at Cannes was Richard Brim from Adam and Eve DDB as Chief Creative Officer. And his talk was Give Them a Punch in the Feels, which I thought was a fantastic title. And he wasn't being a sort of AI denialist, or is that the word? But he sort of said that feeling, human feeling is one of the most sort of powerful tools that we forget, and robots don't have feelings. And I think he quoted Maya Angelou, who said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So I think with his tongue very firmly in cheek, he said, AI can go F itself. It can't feel like we can. So I think that was one of the things that came through at Cannes, was that tech was there to enable humanity. And it was always like, humans 1, robots 0 kind of thing.
It's a really good point. That Maya Angelou quote has come up a few times in, I suppose, the last few years. And I think it's one of the most perfect opportunities to use it is that article from Richard that you quote in your article.
Tariq Hassan from McDonald's, he's I think chief marketer and marketing and customer experience officer based in the US, and he just said an interesting thing in one of his talks. He was on about the fact that advertisers have got all this data and access to every number under the sun, and probably know consumers better than consumers know themselves. But he was saying that it's almost like you've got to step beyond that and really just get to know consumers on a more human level. And he says, just get closer to them, because you have to find the soul of your brand in the soul of your customers. So invite them in, get them to create content, let them look at what they do, observe their behaviors, watch their TikToks. And I just thought that idea of soul is really interesting. So when a marketer that's got access, as I say, to machines and data and, that very empirical side of the business, the fact that they're looking into something which is very ephemeral and very human and intangible and hard for AI to sort of grasp at this stage. And that's the word soul, which goes back to what we said before about, the best advertising creative has got a soul and an emotional kicker that really connects or, motivates you. Then I thought that's what I took out of Cannes was at the moment, there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen. Is it going to be chaos or liberation? But I think at the moment, humans are winning over the machines because we're using it to get to good solutions. So
yeah, well said. There's a few things there which I think stood out. One is the fact that, you said creative directors are using it as a way of showing what not to do. That kind of, creativity has to only work in the context of what's come before it, and originality is key. So if they're basing everything on the past, then actually it's probably not the best place to be looking, albeit maybe it would be sometimes. But the idea of feeling and soul is key. And ultimately, if we get to a point where AI can design for humans better than humans can, then I think we've got bigger problems to worry about.
I know. This guy, Russ Mashmeyer, I think he works at Shopify on the sort of spatial commerce. And he was saying by 2030, machines will have surpassed human creative capabilities. So will humans become surplus? We're like, no, even he acknowledged that the future of creativity and commerce is still going to be driven by human beings. But I think AI is good. It's good. I think a lot of creatives should take it as a real motivating tool and a bit of a, getting people out of their comfort zones, because we commented at Contagious around I'm not sure if you remember that Tiffany recently collaborated with Nike on a shoe. Yeah. And there was a hype before it came out. And people went on to like DALL-E and Midjourney and so on, and started creating what they felt should be the ultimate, Tiffany Nike collab. And then they were some fantastic, amazing, really sort of futuristic, interesting, slightly divergent objects were coming out of this exercise. And then when the actual shoe itself landed, it was really dull.
It was, yeah. People were really deflated, right?
Uninspirational. It was like, maybe that's a case of like robots one, humans nil on that one. So yeah, so if we can just, there's a way of harnessing some of the power. I still think we're at a phase where we need to take a lot of AI with a pinch of salt. I think someone described ChatGPT as having the capacity to hallucinate facts.
Yes.
To just like make things up. Just make things up.
It does, yeah.
It draws very strange conclusions or just tells lies just for the sake of convenience sake.
Yeah, I've got friends who can do that well enough. I don't need I don't need it.
Yes.
There's a line in your article actually where you say holding companies scrambled to show they were in front of the wave, the AI wave specifically. Yeah. I know that we all need to take Cannes increasingly, I would suggest, with a pinch of salt, because it is a catwalk of sorts, right? But do you think it's a problem that companies do try and show they're in front of the wave, or at least surfing a wave perhaps, when they don't even know which direction it's going in? Or is that just a reflection of the reality of Adland?
I think it's a reflection of the reality of Adland, because that's one of the reasons that people enjoy working in the business, is that you've constantly got to be on the edge of what's happening, and you've got to have an incredibly diverse knowledge base, and one of our sort of phrases is like, stay curious, otherwise you will not thrive in this industry if you don't have a curious mindset. I think agencies and holding companies would argue that they are obliged to be on the cusp of new technology. Anything that's going to influence, consumer purchase patterns, consumer behavior, the wider society, or, you've got to have a point of view on it, and you've got to have a sense of expertise. I mean, I don't know, for me, I think Cannes is an important place, an important festival. Some people dismiss it as a sort of like creative love fest, but I think there's a lot of serious conversations go on. I think it's now kind of got that sweet spot where sufficient numbers of marketers go en masse, plus publishers, media owners. Obviously, you've got the ad tech and social media platforms and so on. But it just feels like it's crystallized enough now that the influencers, the players, the decision makers are all in one space. Some of the content is, frippery and so on, but I think there's a lot of very serious conversations happen at Cannes, and stuff that does win is, they've probably got the percentages for it, but it's probably like 1% of global advertising output, and it is very much a barometer. And I think for me, the sort of the advantage of it is that marketers now are really keen to win at Cannes. They all want to be Creative Marketer of the Year. They want to have a Gold Lion Hall. If they don't win sufficient medals, then they're sort of asking their agencies why not. And that basically fosters what I said before about having a creative culture. Businesses actually want to win at Cannes. That's good for creativity in general, because it means that you have to invest in creativity, because that it is a business multiplier. There's that very famous, often used Bill Bernbach quote, which I think was in issue 1 of Contagious in 2004. But it was that, creativity is the last legal means of gaining an unfair advantage over your competition. And it still really, really stands. I think particularly more so now, because there's so much content and noise and clutter, and it's much, much harder to be, get noticed, stand out, and so on. So therefore, creativity arguably is even more valuable when you do land sort of Gold Lion winning, or, if it gets through the Contagious filter. We always talk about looking at the sort of the very, very best work. So we always see ourselves as a kind of editorial award show, because we reject 10 times more ideas than we feature.
It's interesting, actually. I'm only just kind of thinking about this point now, but how much technology in Adland is increasingly part of the world outside Adland. And I mean, you referenced in your article Will.i.am, or as I much prefer him, as he was introduced on a French TV chat show once, Will Je suis. This is wonderful. That will always live with me. But we've had Bob Hoffman on a long time ago now, and he quite rightly, I think, talks about ad tech and the kind of threat to democracy that ad tech has maybe enabled. We don't need to go into that argument now, because I know it's a lot more complex than that. And Mark Lewis, who's the Dean of the School of Communication Arts, I remember probably last year he was on, and he talked about how what's interesting is these big kind of ad tech social companies, say Facebook, for example, or Meta, I should say, actually now their financial might is more significant than many countries. So actually what we kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of technology and culture, quite rightly actually affects everything. It's not just, we work with quite a few law/legal professional service businesses. And I heard a story from their world recently where they're using AI to look for problems in legal contracts or very complex contracts, and the speed at which it's been able to do that, and crucially the accuracy at which it's been able to be used is phenomenal. So yeah, it is important to have your finger on the pulse.
Yeah. What's interesting, though, going back to Cannes, was that one of the biggest winners, I think they got 3 Grand Prix across the week, was Apple. You know, arguably the world's biggest and most successful tech company. And their ads, which are all fundamentally about tech, they're all basically glorified product demos. All of them were incredibly human. You know, they were all featuring people with disabilities using Apple technology to empower their lives and do incredible creative things. You know, the other one about the one that won the film Grand Prix, which is like R.I.P. Leon, where the guy thinks he's killed the lizard pet of his best friend who's on holiday, sends a text to that effect, then realizes that he hasn't and unsends it. Really funny, simple human film. And that's from Apple. So you've got this company that's got access to all sorts of, data and technology platforms and that financial clout bigger than most countries in the world. Yet they still are reverting back to very human, very simple, very traditional advertising.
Yeah, their latest, is it the iPhone 14, the battery life ad they've just released of the guy just on his tractor, and that huge long straight is beautiful for that similar reason.
And Tor Myron, who's the Apple CMO on stage in Cannes, he talked about the role of agencies, and he was saying agencies are still incredibly valuable. They've still got a place, but only if they see themselves as what he described as outside agitators. Having a point of view, keeping clients honest, and that's their value over AI and whatever, is having that point of view that you're not going to get from programmatic or generative AI created content. It's that point of view, that honesty, and so on. So if they remember that awful Kendall Jenner ad for Pepsi a few years ago, that happened because at the time they did through an in-house agency, and the argument there is no external agency would have allowed that to happen, because it was so out of tune, it was so tone deaf, and it was an honest advertising agency would not have allowed their client to produce that, because they'd have warned them that it wouldn't go down well with people because they have a better understanding of the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I've long said that the agency should be more like a personal trainer at the gym, where they're challenging you and agitating and, so on and so forth, than someone who just says yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Time, weather, and...
Boom. Sorry, it's just most podcasts would drop a jarring advert into this vacuous point in space and time, but Gasp don't do podcast ads. And if we did, we'd probably subvert the form in a clever way that ironically gets you to contact the host at giles@gasp.agency. Only recently, some pod listening companies did just that, calling us for guidance on client retention and research. Please don't do that. Now, let's get you back to the show.
Oh, God. Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Whoops. Yeah, I'll have what she's having. Yeah, hang on a minute.
I know we've got a couple of listener questions to get to, but before we do, I want to ask you about a point in your book, The Contagious Commandments, which we will link to in this episode listing. Your thoughts around asking heretical questions, which is something, again, I mentioned in your intro. What would you describe as a heretical question, and why is it a commandment that you think marketers should live by?
Yeah, if you look at the definition of heresy, it's about voicing dissent or deviation from a dominant theory, opinion, or practice. So on simple terms, it's saying the unsayable or challenging the status quo. And I think the reason it's so valuable within an advertising context is that advertising traditionally is driven by status quo. I used to work at Leo Burnett for many years and helped to run the creative councils, where we had a ladder, which is like a 1 to 10 scale. Basically, how do you judge and rate advertising? And 4 out of 10 on that scale was cliche. And the sort of proposition behind that was that in any category, anywhere in the world, 80% of the content generated is cliche. If I say to you a shampoo commercial, you can see the cliches in your head. If I told you a car commercial, think of a car commercial for 10 seconds, you're going to have obvious cliches in your head. And I think we talked about asking heretical questions because so many brands kind of ask what's in it for them rather than asking what's in it for the audience. They have all these sales messages and KPIs that they want to communicate in their ads. which means that so much of the advertising kind of industry's content is boring, formulaic, safe, stereotypical, and so on. And a way of getting out of that, in a really kind of provocative way, is by asking heretical questions. And it's hard, as I say, we quoted this study from Cornell University that was really interesting, where they did this research and found that creativity, because it's associated with risk, that when business people were presented with ideas that felt unorthodox, a little bit risky, something they'd never done before, the same triggers, the same reactions that are going on in their body at a very subliminal level were those associated with poison, vomit, and agony.
Right.
Which is weird, which explains why, as I say, so much of marketing is safe, never going to lose my job by signing this off, but it means that consumers kind of ignore it. So what we say is that if you ask a really difficult question and you get to some interesting, deviant, kind of unorthodox answers, chances are your competitors are nowhere near that. So we sort of recommend an exercise that the guy called Hal Gregerson pioneered from MIT called question storming. And his argument was that brainstorming is for wimps. Like, if you do a brainstorming session, you normally come up with ideas inspired by the person that's just done the speech half an hour earlier, or an existing brief, or something you've read that day, or, so basically you just unearth solutions that are very close to the surface. So he's got this thing called question storming or question burst or catalytic questions, I think he calls them. But it's basically where you ask 50 questions of a problem or a brief, and you don't answer them. And that's the trick. So when we run these in workshops with clients, it's like trying to get them not to start providing answers to the questions, because they will, oh no, can't afford that. That's been done before. We never get that through. That's not our KPI. It's like, no, ask 50 questions. What happens is people kind of rush to about 25 and then start to get a little bit tired. And it's like, no, keep going. And then they sort of get exhausted getting to 40. And then his argument is keep going, because between 40 to 50, you get that, what he calls the big unlock. And it could be questions that get right to the heart of, questioning the fundamental principles of which your company is based on, or a campaign that's existed for 20 years or whatever. But the argument or the value of heretical questions is if you can get to the right answer that propels your business forward, then you're in that blue ocean space, that famous, INSEAD professor blue ocean space, where your competitors are still fighting in the red ocean space where everyone else is. But because your idea is so radical and so heretical, you're in this beautiful, calm waters because no one's had the guts or the tenacity to get there, kind of thing.
Yeah, I like the idea of question storming. It's interesting because the only other Jeremy Bullmore quote that I often reach for is the fact that a brand's success is as reliant on the actions of its competitors as much, if not more, than its own actions. Something along those lines. That's not verbatim, but I think that point of the kind of relative behaviour in the context of your sector is bang on, and I really like that.
Yeah, and you talked about Rory Sutherland. He was saying, businesses love single right answers, and you feel like you get rewarded for coming up with a single right answer. I think Ed Catmull, in that brilliant, ex-Pixar, in his book, he was saying about everyone thinks the point of their work is arriving at smart answers. And then, you can mistake an answer for the end of an effort. And he was saying, like, at Pixar, one of the joys of working at Pixar and why they were so original and imaginative and creative was that they would celebrate arriving at a point from there. You see that as a jumping off point rather than an end point. So the opposite of a good idea can sometimes be a good idea, sort of thing. So keep going.
Yeah, I always encourage people at Gasp, especially new starters, to come in and ask as many dumb questions as they like, because they're able to at that stage. And dumb questions they're so disarming, and they're so important to enable you to just check yourself and what you're doing.
I couldn't agree more, and that's something that Contagious, advisory unit, when we're doing this sort of ask heretical question workshops, like one of the things we say is that you've got to bake it into your culture, and like literally the newest, the most junior person in the room has got the same ranking as the chief exec. Like, you've got to have this complete freedom to be as deviant and heretical as you possibly can. And, you get to some good places. So I think some of the brands that we've used as a one was REI, which is a bit like Patagonia. It's like a sort of outdoor clothing chain in the US, like a membership sort of company. And their heretical question was, why don't we close our stores on Black Friday? Because again, similar to, Patagonia made a similar move, but I think REI did it. Literally, they shut every single store because they said, people should be going out, celebrating, enjoying the great outdoors, rather than just adding to this sort of unsustainability of mass consumption. In the end, they sort of created a movement, and loads of other marketers, retailers joined in, and they didn't lose. They actually ended up, year on year, delivered better results because they got a rush of job applications, people who wanted to work for them. We've written a lot about Liquid Death, a really interesting water brand that's about to come to the UK, I think, from the US, and complete heretical way of looking at the water category. Which, let's face it, if I said to you bottled water and advertising, you start thinking of mountains and babies and lots of white T-shirts and, natural springs and fir trees and so on. These guys took a death metal aesthetic. Their tagline was "Murder Your Thirst." They went into aluminium cans, which they say are more sustainable than plastic bottles. And because of that, and because of the way that their packaging looked, ripped on alcohol advertising to freak people out. Their launch commercial had somebody being a marketer being waterboarded on the premise that water is actually more dangerous than energy drinks. So they've come on with this punk attitude and absolutely flying. They make millions in merchandise sales because they built up such a loyal kind of following, but all based on this heretical question of why does the water category have to be based around purity? Why can't it be based around punk?
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Yeah, they're a great brand to check out if you're unfamiliar.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump to listener questions now. So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but that's not stopped us asking. So as usual, we've selected two. I'm going to start with Jenny. Jenny asks, what ads have you seen recently that give you hope for the future of the industry? I suppose you could probably include Liquid Death in that, but are there any others?
I think brands, I would say, rather than ads. So I think I've got a lot of respect for Dove and what they're doing. And I think one of the things that they did recently was that Turn Your Back campaign, which is when there was this weird filter on TikTok, like bold glamour, that makes people look incredibly but artificially beautiful. Like it's ridiculous. And they basically led the backlash against that. And they could do it because the authenticity they've built up through their Real Beauty platform and all of the work that they've done around, promoting, this sort of natural, open conversation around what beauty is. So they could create this campaign to the point where they got people even attending the Oscars to turn their back to the cameras. A really powerful movement to try and get these things shut down. And I think that's where brands really sort of have a place, because there's an academic from MIT called Grant McCracken, and he was saying that the best brands act like networks of the unacquainted, which is where people who don't know each other but can congregate around a common cause. And brands have got the perfect position to do that through their media muscle, their creativity, their clout and reputation. And I just think what Dove have done recently around that, proves the power that brands can, yes, be creative, do creative content, but actually make a difference and, have a really strong sense of purpose. I hate the fact that purpose has become a bit of a dirty word in the industry, because, it shouldn't. I think brands can do both.
Brilliant answer, but just for the purposes of stressing this before I ask the second question, because our listeners won't believe me, Paul has no idea what question 2 is, but it feels particularly apt given your answer to question 1. So Mel, for question 2, asks, do you think the industry pendulum is swinging back from the era of fake purpose to actual proper commercial purpose?
I would hope so. Yes. I mean, it's one of the things that we sort of picked up on in our sort of Can Deconstructed deck that's doing the rounds at the moment. But yes, I would hope so. IKEA is a fantastic example of how to get it absolutely right, because I think purpose is really important. We tend to use the phrase organizing principle at Contagious, because I think that's better. Like, what is your brand's organizing principle? It could be your North Star, but like, what is the very foundation that your company is built on? And that should be the tent pole that everything hangs off, from creative communications to HR to everything about that business. And IKEA rediscovered their original purpose, which was written by the founder back in the 70s, which was, better everyday design for everyday people. So they can apply that to everything they design and layout of the stores and simplicity and all that side of things. But when it comes to their marketing communications, they can do ads that have got dinosaurs riffing off grime tunes, people doing very sort of low-cost versions of cribs and so on. I have a lot of fun in their communications, but then still do things like massive sustainability drives, where you can actually bring back IKEA furniture and they'll buy it off you and give you a discount on new furniture. They've got like a circular economy programs going. And, the better everyday design thing is one of their platforms is that they invest in refugees in different countries around the world to give them jobs at IKEA and language training. And then in like disaster zones and so on, they will build refugee shelters and shelters generally. But guess what? They're IKEA shelters, so better everyday design. They're fantastic. They really stand out. They work. They're very human. So, it's a very long-winded way of saying, if you can actually get very, very purposeful purpose that is linked to the very fabric of your brand and, can make a difference in the world, then why not? But still have fun with your communications. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Fantastic. The final part of the interview is our 4 pertinent poses that we put to all of our guests, starting with, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Okay, I think that I would try very hard to be a billionaire by the time I was 25 so that I could buy the Daily Mail and shut it down, still destroy it, and hopefully we'd still be in the European Union. And then whatever millions I had left, I would place a bet on Leicester City winning the Premier League, even though I'm a Middlesbrough fan. Yes. And then finally, I would basically tell myself that in my 50s, I would be the majority shareholder of a company called Contagious with a tagline of, "Have you got it yet?" in the middle of a global pandemic that was effectively locked the world down for 2 years. But everything was going to be fine. In fact, your business will actually end up growing after 2 years of lockdown.
Wow. I hadn't even thought about how you must have felt during the pandemic. But yeah, absolutely. Wow.
It was interesting because a lot of, clients rallied round and they were like, what could we do to help? Let's start accelerating all those like digital training programs we've been talking to you about. Let's, sort of just test things out and experiment. But people that didn't know us, we had absolute ding-dongs on LinkedIn. We weren't expecting it at all. We took down some of our marketing. We had this campaign that was running around the "Have you got it yet" tagline of one of our sales guys dressed in a HasChem suit in various business scenarios. So that went very quickly out of sensitivity. Sure. But people were literally saying on LinkedIn, "Your name is toxic. If I was one of your clients, I'd refuse to work with you. You're associated with death and dying. And, basically you need to change your company name."
Wow.
And this went on sustained across various, it wasn't just one or two cranks. It was numerous people. So in the end, we ended up writing a statement that went on social media and also the front cover of our magazine saying we're not going to change our name because there's 2 definitions for contagious. And one is medical, obviously, but the second is about spreading information, joy, entertainment, laughter, whatever. And now more than ever in lockdown, this is where brands can step up and be educators and entertainers and benefactors and actually help. So we will continue to showcase the very best of brand-funded creativity because God, the world needs it.
Well done for fielding so many morons. That must have been quite frustrating. But number 2, then, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
Yeah, probably because of my age, but ageism. I think it's the only tolerated prejudice in marketing at the moment. I think there's an obsession with youth. You talked earlier about the legal industry. It's like if you go to any other profession, like law, medicine, publishing, whatever, the age range is so much more balanced. In advertising, once you get to 50, it's almost like you're regarded as sort of like geriatric. You're sort of past it. And I just find that really strange when there's such a sort of demand for diversity, equity, inclusion. The way that the industry kind of briefs sometimes, you think that anyone over 50 is irrelevant. And yeah, I don't get that. I think ageism is really divisive. And it also sort of taps into that, I can understand why the industry uses demographics and so on, but I just find it very disingenuous. We wrote an article about that OK Boomer debate and just how awful it was. And it was like, Freddie Mercury was born in the same year as Donald Trump, as was Dolly Parton, as was Jeffrey Dahmer. Are you going to say they're all the same type of people? It's nonsense, absolute nonsense. Like 2 are psychopaths and 2 are like ridiculously flamboyant, creative, generous, talented people. So yes, ageism.
with the caveat of it's a lot more complicated than that. I gave a talk to Joe Glover's wonderful The Marketing Meetup about value-based pricing and how to price creativity not long ago. And it was one of the, I suppose there were quite a few things which I thought weren't helped by the existing most common agency models out there, because I'm sure that's been played a part, sadly, let's say. Number 3, any books that you would recommend? So before you answer that, we will link to the Contagious Commandments, 10 Steps to Brand Bravery, which you penned a while ago now.
Yes, with Chris Barth, my colleague in America. But I wouldn't be so gauche as to recommend that one. So thank you, Giles. So I said I'm an English grad. So like fundamentally, I'm always torn between. I always have to have a fiction book on the go and a business book on the go.
Perfect.
So fiction-wise, I'm a massive Max Porter fan. I've just read his new book, Shy, which is about a sort of troubled teenager in a home. And it's just, he's also written, Grief is a Thing with Feathers and Lanny and so on. But I just find as a writer, he is the most incredible wordsmith, that he writes in a really kind of economical, distinctive, sometimes very deviant or divergent way, but so profound, so emotional. It's one of those people I just keep going back and reading paragraphs or reading sentences and thinking, oh my God, like your allegories or the way that you land a thought is just incredible. So from an advertising industry point of view, I think people should read more Max Porter, because what he does with language is just so profound and intense and ingenious and creative. So Max Porter on the book, on the sort of fiction. And then I'll think about this on the business side of books. When people join Contagious on the editorial and advisory side, we have a book list. So they're given homework that they're expected to read within their sort of first few weeks at Contagious. There's 5 that we sort of insist on, and then there's sort of bigger library beyond that. But there's Anatomy of Humbug by Paul Feldwick, where he sort of picks apart all the sort of contradictory beliefs about advertising and, tries to get you to think more flexibly about how you connect with humans, and his sort of fame angle. How brands grow, obviously, because I think so many brands are still influenced by Byron Sharp's thinking about, mental availability and so on. So that's a really good one to be aware of. How Not to Plan. The Planner's Bible, myth busting, absolutely fantastic handbook. Again, brilliantly written. The Choice Factory by Richard Shotton. I know he's got a new book out as well at the moment that we covered a couple of months ago. But yeah, I think again, behavioural biases. You've got to understand what influences people and why. And then just from a strategy point of view, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummeld. Because it's all about how to implement action. And it's like sometimes strategy goes hand in hand with creativity. So if you understand how to action things and understand the idea of like the value of strategy in business, then that informs your perception of creativity. And then, my sort of current read that I've got on my bedside table is Atomic Habits by James Clear. I think it's fantastic. It's all about building how you build good habits and break bad ones. And I have a lot of bad habits, and I found that I've actually this has helped me to lose weight, exercise more, and all sorts of stuff. So I think that's a really good one, Atomic Habits.
Okay, brilliant. We'll list to all of those. And then number 4, then, we always dedicate every episode to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your view, to our guest who has to give the reason why. So would you kindly dedicate this episode?
It's going to sound really, really cheesy, and I don't want it to, but my wife, Sue, because we literally met at university, so we've been together a hell of a long time, and she sort of gave up, life to travel to America on my behalf when I worked at Leo Burnett, and I could have, when I left Leo Burnett and before we set up Contagious, I could have gone to an equally comfy job at another big agency network. And instead, she let me kind of take the risk on this weird little idea called Contagious, written on the back of a beer mat in a pub. And, with 3 kids at home, basically gave me the strength and the scope to launch Contagious, and has been there, ever since, kind of thing. So yes, I without her, Contagious wouldn't have existed, because it was part faith and part allowing me to take a risk. And she works in education, my wife. So she's a Senko at a big primary school in Hertfordshire. And I always say that, I've sold my soul to the advertising devil. I've got a beautiful, wonderful job, and it's taken me all over the world, and I absolutely love it. But, I'm not doing something as fundamentally as important as helping severely autistic kids, dyslexic kids, fighting the educational system the way that she does. So it's like she's restored the karma. She's the yin to my,
it's the balance,
to my yang. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, this episode is very, very proudly dedicated to your wife, Sue. Paul, thank you firstly, thank you for all of those books. So we've got Atomic Habits, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, The Choice Factory, How Not to Plan, How Brands Grow, Anatomy of Humbug, and Max Porter's Shy. Thank you for those. Thank you for giving us question storming and the big unlock. I'm just going through all my manic notes here. Zero-based creativity. Thank you for reminding me to buy those Nordic socks on Instagram. How else can our listeners get more Paul Kemp-Robertson?
Sign up to the Contagious newsletter at contagious.com. And then once you see how wonderful the content is on that, you think, oh my God, what's hiding behind the paywall? So subscribe to a membership at Contagious IQ, please, for your team. And then we've got a sort of Contagious Live in the flesh. We're doing the Most Contagious conference in London in December, in Islington and New York in January. And obviously do buy the Contagious book published by Penguin. So that would be great. Appreciate that.
Perfect. Well, all of those are linked in this episode, so it should be easy to find. So I've really enjoyed this, Paul. It's been ace, mate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. As I say, I sort of felt like a bit of an imposter syndrome, but I've really enjoyed the chat. Hopefully I haven't talked too much, but it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for some really interesting questions.
Oh, not at all. Thank you so much. And finally, thank you to everyone listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share and review the podcast. Keep your questions and guest requests coming in. To get in touch, it's easy to find Gasp online, or you can just email the mouthful, that is call to action at gasp.agency.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.